New York, and at the time he also enlisted in the Army Reserve. When he took his discharge in '68, he opened up his medical practice, which included general pediatrics and pediatric allergies. At the same time, he also had an appointment to the New York State Department of Health. 2 years later, the Army thought that Dr. Bauer was still inactive.
Mistake. 16 years later.
16 years later?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. 16 years later, the Army thought that Dr. Bauer was still on active reserve time and offered him an active reserve status as a full colonel. Colonel Bauer served in the Army Reserve for another 2 years, getting specialization in chemical, biological, and nuclear warfare defense. Let me tell you something, having gone through their training for that, I can tell you it's very, very extensive, and the doctors really need to know what they're doing on that. With the onset of the HIV epidemic, he traveled throughout New York State, drawing blood of soldiers to check them for HIV and to make sure that the blood they were giving was usable for transfusions. Colonel Bauer then found himself in the National Guard with a more direct role in supporting the active army. All went well until August of 1990 when Saddam Hussein annexed Kuwait and invaded there, and we know what happened after that. It was Desert Storm, and then 10 years after that was Desert Shield. At the time, Dr. Bauer was reactivated to full duty, and he was transferred overseas at the age of 57 for a destination unknown. He arrived in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, with a group of medicine specialists, preventive medicine specialists, and quickly organized a unit given the name Bauer's Raiders. The unit traveled to various locations to teach combat medical care to the soldiers, and his duties include liaison with the Saudi Ministry of Defense, Aviation, and National Guard. He supervised U.S. Army hospitals using Saudi facilities. During this time, there were missile attacks occurring every night. Training of combat forces intensified after January 17, 1991. And on the journey home, Colonel Bauer's military assignment became division surgeon of the 42nd Infantry Division. Colonel Bauer formally retired in 1997 from the Army and as well as retired from his medical practice in 2014. We welcome Colonel Bauer at this time.
Thank you very much for that long introduction. I do want to start things off a little bit. Actually, I owe everything to a name, to a man who we do not like to remember. I owe everything to Adolf Hitler, because without Hitler, I would still be in Vienna. I was in Vienna for the Anschluss. I was in Vienna for Kristallnacht. I was in Vienna when my father was arrested and put into Buchenwald, and also when he was released in 1939. There were no releases from concentration camp after July 39. My father was released in January. At that point, we went to the Netherlands, and after some time, found that there were distant relatives of my father in Elizabeth who sent us the affidavit, and we arrived in Hoboken, October 31st, 1939. So I just wanted that as a quick introduction from where I really came from. Well, uneventful, there's no sense going through a lot of family history, but at one point I found myself, finally after having graduated medical school, I found myself now a full-fledged doctor with a small family earning $200 a month. One of my colleagues said, "You know, I've got a great way to earn a few extra dollars. Let's join the Army Reserve." And there I was, joining the Army Reserve. Fine, 1 weekend a month, didn't do very much, nothing happened. As you heard, after the first 6 months, all of a sudden, there were two things. First of all, I graduated from high school in June of 1950. Korea broke out 1 week after I graduated from high school, but I was 17, so I was too young for the draft. By the time I got old enough for the draft, I had taken deferments, I had student deferments, I became a draft dodger. So for the next 10 years, I was a draft dodger. When I was in medical school, I had to send my draft board information every 6 months, since I was not in the United States, I was in Europe, and they had to translate everything from German and English, and still my draft board was very understanding and left me alone. And before they could send me a notice, I had already enlisted in the reserves. Vietnam, of course, as you well know, broke out 62, 63, 64. Here I was in the reserves, and I was not in a unit that was called up. There were some reserve hospitals called, ours was not. In fact, we were close enough that the hospital from the Bronx was called, but not the one from Buffalo. So I spent the rest of the time at Fort Hamilton signing my name on reports. Then I decided, well, fine, I'm out of the Army, did my job, did everything, and as you heard, 16 years later, they came knocking on the door for me, and there I was. And I had a former student who had stayed in the National Guard. He said, you know, come to the National Guard, we'll be good to you, you won't have to do much work, we just want you being our preventive medicine officer. Well, that worked for a couple of months, and then all of a sudden I lived in Buffalo. The unit was based in Brooklyn, on Marcy Avenue. Very soon I was going to drills in Buffalo to cover myself and going flying to Brooklyn at my expense because they needed me in Brooklyn. And after that, as you heard, there was a HIV epidemic which happened, and I was flying all over New York State. And then everything quieted down again, and then Saddam Hussein decided to invade Kuwait. And of course, by that time, we know the Army normally has 60 to 70% of its medical support in reserve. It's much too expensive to keep that many doctors and medical people on active duty. Now, my youngest son, who just completed 30 years of active duty, went through the whole routine while the Army paid his college, his medical school, his training, and he's now at the University of Pennsylvania as a professor of pediatrics. So the Army can do that, but they usually don't. So this is how I wound up in Saudi Arabia. Most interesting country. Not speaking one word of Arabic, finding that everybody spoke English made it somewhat easier. And it did take about a week. You'll see, I brought a few slides just to show you, I think you see the map. You see where Riyadh is. It was in the news again this morning that there were some sort of skullduggery and people were arrested, and as one Saudi told me, never believe what you hear on the news. We do things in the tent behind the palace. We never do anything in the open, so I don't know what happened there. The only thing that I found with the Saudis, first of all, I was probably the first Jew who most of them had ever seen. Made no secret of it. The Director General of the Saudi Arabian National Guard Hospital told me, you know, Jews, Christians, Muslims, we're all brothers. I don't know what he meant, but that's how he told it to me. And again, it was very, very different, of course. And to wake up in the morning to Allahu Akbar, which has been misused by terrorists. This is a greeting which the muezzin broadcasts from the minaret, the call to worship. Actually, Islam is not a violent religion. They're violent people, but there was Maya Kahanat who we had too. So then Menachem Begin, well, we've had our share of violence as well. But these are not basically tenets of the religion. These are tenets of people. But getting back to one thing that I had an advantage of course, wearing a uniform. First of all, they were impressed that I had a degree from a European university and was in the American Army. The other thing is that I was a colonel doctor from headquarters. So that put me in an entirely different light, and I could talk to Saudis on a different level. And at that time, when we arrived, and in the beginning, there was a big concern with the use of chemical weapons by Saddam Hussein. We did not know how little he had and how poor they were. We expected to have some sophistication from World War I. What we found is what little he had was useless. It didn't do what the hype said it would do. We were all ready for it. We got the hospitals ready. We had decontamination centers. We worked on all of that. Fortunately, it was all for naught. Then, of course, there were other things that I was involved in, very esoteric things. How do you put up a latrine in the middle of the desert? If you have soldiers and nothing else, it becomes a real problem. The Saudis in the beginning did not want to have pits as were used in Vietnam. Burnout pits for waste, because they thought that that would contaminate the area, but in time we wound up having that as well. So, of course, everybody knows once the war started, it was very interesting. I still wake up at about 2 o'clock every morning because that's when the sergeant knocked on my door and said incoming missiles. The Iraqis could do quite well. They sent missiles to us and they sent missiles to Tel Aviv. And I don't know, I think somebody died of a heart attack in Tel Aviv. And we never found out what damage they really made in Riyadh because they hit in civilian areas and the Saudis would not release any information. So that was the experience there. Of course, fortunately, the war didn't last very long. I did do some work with the Saudis afterwards. Again, I was in a position where I could work with Saudis constantly, and though toward the end of our time there, one Saudi hospital administrator said, "I hate Ramadan. You can't get any work done from anybody." This was a gentleman who had a master's from Michigan State University. So there is a very different type of experience, a very different type of war. Fortunately, we had very few casualties. What happened afterwards, I won't get into because that's much more politics rather than a military job. Yes, I am a life member of the Jewish war veterans. I have not found a group in New Jersey to join. I've been in New Jersey 10 years. I still belong to Post 25 in Buffalo. So that's about it. The only thing is, when I did go overseas, I was in solo medical practice. The Army gave us zero in compensation for our turning our back, walking out on our patients, and serving in uniform. I did find somebody who did cover my practice somewhat. At that time, this is 1990, alternative lifestyles were not always accepted, and I had patients who objected to a female physician in an alternative lifestyle. I heard about that when I came back. So there are many things and many problems which we can face, and basically that's it. I brought some slides along. I had slides, I had them made into a disc, and I thought some of these might be interesting. I had a small camera. They're not the greatest, but they're views of Saudi Arabia that are usually not seen because they're not official photographs. So I thought that we could have a look at them.